Here's what I know about LSRO. It did a literature review back in 2004, if I'm not mistaken on the year, and came to the conclusion that these studies that it reviewed did not show a risk of adverse effects. I don't think that that committee of scientists was the most credentialed that I've seen. I'm pretty familiar with the people that routinely publish on amalgam. I did not recognize any of the names on that committee. Pretty smart guys, they've got PhDs, but they're not published in this area. But what's interesting about LSRO to me is the treatment of that report by FDA in 2009, because FDA defined away most of the literature that I think is significant on this issue, and that shows pathology associated with the use of dental amalgam. FDA told us in the paper that it wasn't going to consider certain papers. For example, it didn't consider a paper by Japanese investigator Nagem. Nagem came to the conclusion in 1984 that with increasing exposure to elemental mercury, one was at greater risk of contracting idiopathic Parkinson's disease. Well, gee, that sounds pretty important, since the primary source of mercury is dental amalgam fillings, at least in the non-occupational population. So I've always thought Nagem offered us a pretty important paper and reached the personal conclusion that if I'm exposed to a greater quantity of mercury, I'm more likely to contract Parkinson's. Gee, I don't want to do that. So that's something I think that FDA ought to be looking at. Instead, it refused to look at Nagem for two reasons. One, it wasn't a paper that specifically involved amalgam fillings. Gee, that seems a little short-sighted. But more compellingly, it didn't look at Nagem because it predates 2004. Well, what's significant about 2004? That's when the LSRO paper came out. And because LSRO concluded that we didn't need to worry about any of these papers prior to 2004, FDA felt alleviated of any responsibility to look further back in history than 2004. Well, we've got some review papers. I mean, after all, that's all LSRO is a review of the literature. We've got some authors that have done their own literature review and reached a completely diametrically opposite conclusion. And so certainly, if FDA is going about this in an unbiased manner, we'd want them to look at those review papers. In fact, FDA refused to look at any review papers. By definition, they said if it's a review paper, it's not new empirical evidence, we don't have to look at it. Well, wait a minute. You looked at LSRO and you not only considered the conclusions of the LSRO panel, you used it to exclude all the science prior to 2004. That doesn't seem very unbiased to me.